Welcome to the Business Talk, a global podcast series that highlights distinguished faculty members and their impactful scholarly contributions. I am Deepak, your host from India. We are honored to host the distinguished Dr. Rory Naismith on Business Talk today. Before we get started, I would like to introduce the guest for today's episode. Dr. Rory Naismith is a professor of early medieval English history in the Department of Anglo-Saxon, Norse, and Celtic at the University of Cambridge, and a fellow of the historic Corpus Christi College. A Cambridge-trained scholar through and through, he completed his undergraduate and graduate studies in Anglo-Saxon, Norse, and Celtic at Trinity College, Cambridge, before undertaking postdoctoral research at the Fitzwilliam Museum and Clare College. He subsequently brought his expertise to King's College, London, where he lectured for 4 years before returning to Cambridge. Professor Naismith's research is distinguished by its creative use of both material culture and written records, mostly notably coinage, to reconstruct the economic and social fabric of Anglo-Saxon England. His scholarship has contributed to landmark discoveries, including helping to trace the mysterious origins of early medieval European silver coinage, a finding that is reshaping our understanding of Europe's economic and political transformation. He is currently completing a major study on the social impact of monetization in early medieval England and its neighbors, forthcoming from Princeton University Press. Beyond the early medieval economy, his recent work spans Anglo-Saxon, London's urban development, the land market in early England, and early medieval guilds, demonstrating a breadth of inquiry that connects numismatics, social history, and institutional development. With over 1,100 citations to his name on Google Scholar, Professor Naismith stands as a leading voice in global medieval studies. In today's episode, we are truly privileged to sit down with Professor Rory Naismith, one of Cambridge's most distinguished medieval historians, as he shares key insights from his acclaimed book, Making Money in the Early Middle Ages. Let's not keep you waiting. Please join me in welcoming Professor Rory Naismith to the conversation. Professor Naismith, your gracious acceptance of our invitation means a great deal to us, and it is with an immense honor and delight that we welcome you on Business Talk.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Thank you. Professor, the early medieval period is often called the Dark Ages, a time of economic regression. But your book challenges that narrative. What first drew you to argue that coined money was very much alive and meaningful during this era, even its scare?
Well, Deepak, the scholarship on this, when I was a student and first came to this subject 20 or so years ago, held that there really wasn't anything of interest going on in the early Middle Ages with coinage. And that was primarily because there simply hadn't been many coins of this period found. And the few which had been found came from contexts like burials, high status burials of kings and people like that. And so the theory was that the coins changed hands only in very high status formal settings, things like gift giving, and that they weren't really a significant part of the economy. What changed since then, what was in the middle of changing at that point actually, was that in some parts of Western Europe, including England and Wales, there was a revolution with people going out and finding early medieval coins, other things as well, but they found a lot of early medieval coins. And these showed that actually there were an awful lot of these things in circulation. They were being used much more widely and on a larger scale. There are still questions about exactly what role they played, and we can talk about those in a few minutes, because the finds are still relatively few compared to those from the Roman period, the later Middle Ages. But at the same time, they tell us an awful lot. So what I want to do with this book was set out to answer this question: how it was that this currency, this form of coinage, worked, why people carried on making it at a time when it was relatively scarce, and the few coins that there were in circulation tended to be made of gold or silver. So they were comparatively valuable. We're talking about an individual coin which would have been worth anything from a few tens of modern pounds, dollars, euros, through to probably 200 or 300 in the case of gold coins. That was really all you had in terms of hard cash. So it was quite a challenge to think of how you could square that circle, how you could imagine this coinage playing a significant role and lighting up the Dark Ages just a little bit.
Professor, one of the most provocative ideas in your book is that scarcity itself gave coins greater significance. Can you explain how having less money actually made it more powerful as a social and economic tool?
Yes, I'll do my best. I think it's doing this in a couple of ways. One is that, in a sense, although there is not much cash around, this is still a very highly monetized society. Lots of the groups who lived in England, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, places like that, they were still very, very used to thinking in terms of monetary units. They evaluated the world around them, the products they used, the commodities they produced, even abstract things like honor and people's lives and things like that. That was all valued using the same denominations as the coins they were actually using. So even when they weren't actually exchanging bits of gold or silver or anything else, they were still thinking in those terms. That's hugely important because, again, it's often been supposed that this period was one where people just didn't deal in money at all. Quite the opposite. They were used to dealing in money all the time. Dealing in coin was the exception. And so I think that's one that leads into the second reason why I think the coin is important, because it becomes a way of demonstrating what kind of transaction you're doing, especially when there's not much of it. Using a coin makes a statement. So you find a number of cases where coins are used for rituals, ceremonies, like both the freeing and the enslavement of people. They're associated with trying to demonstrate that a transaction has a certain kind of finality. It's got a public quality about it. So I think coinage is taking on a special role when it's very, very scarce like that. And it's also, I think, quite simply got the same value that coined money does in, well, as cash does in most societies, which is that it helps facilitate movements of goods between people. That didn't go away. People did still find coins useful for that same purpose when you were dealing with markets, you were dealing with more abstracted transactions between parties who didn't always know each other. And for that reason, it was in demand. You can draw very interesting comparisons between how coinage is used in this period and what you see in, say, the 15th century in the Paston letters from England, when coinage again is very scarce, and you can see that it's actually playing a much more prominent part in people's lives. They're having to think about where their money is coming from. They're having to deal carefully with other people to make sure that they do make ends meet in terms of hard cash, because both these societies are hardwired to think in terms of coined money, even if they're often using the units for something else. And so it means that when there just aren't many of those coins around, they've not then they can manage without in some ways, but there are certain contexts where they do expect there will be coins at the end of the day. And so I think that's why it's still important. It's still playing that backup role. It's a statement of power and authority on the part of rulers. It's serving a number of roles. And I think that scarcity actually accentuates that. Scarcity, I think, made the role of these coins much more of a talking point, much more of a concern than it was at many other times and places.
Processing trace a dramatic monetary shift from gold coinage in the post-Roman period to the rise of the silver penny in the 7th century. What drove this transformation and what did it mean for ordinary people's relationship with money?
Gold coins are very valuable. A gold coin was worth in this period usually 12, 14 times as much as silver by weight. So a silver coin is already pretty valuable, and a gold coin is extremely valuable. It's the difference if you were in, say the US, it's the difference between, what would it be, a $5 note and a $50 note. That they both are not always ideal if you want to get something very small indeed, but one is rather more applicable than the other. So in practical terms, I think that this does, to a certain extent, facilitate the extension of coined money. People will use it more, they will be able to do more with their coins. This shift from gold to silver comes about because of a number of specific circumstances in Northwest Europe. It seems to have started in Southeast England and the immediately neighbouring parts of mainland Europe, what's now the Low Countries, and then soon it spreads from there to what's now France, to other parts of England, and then gradually, as you move through the 8th and 9th century, to other places. And one factor in this is partly supply and demand. It seems that gold is no longer as there's no longer as much of it. They just aren't able to get enough bullion to carry on making the coinage. And in England and the northern part of Francia, that's resulted in a gradual tail off in the quality of these coins. The amount of gold in each one has been gradually tapering down until you end up with groups which are spanning gold and silver. You have some coins which will have about 5% gold in them. You'll have some which will have less than 1%, which are effectively silver coins. And then one day, no pun intended, the penny drops and people suddenly start just making silver coins, and they make them in abundance because they're sitting on a big stock of silver which has come in from the Mediterranean at earlier times, and this is what they are able to use and sustain this new burst of silver, which is one of the great surprises of the period, that there's an awful lot of coinage being made and used in Eastern England and Northwest mainland Europe in the last decades of the 7th century and the first decades of the 8th century.
Professor, the conventional view holds that early medieval coins were mainly the preserve of kings, gift givers, and long distance merchants. Your research directly counters this. Who else was actually using money and how?
Well, I touched on this a little bit before, that traditionally there was a reliance on certain coin finds, hoards, burials, tombs, which contained coins in these settings that suggested people of high status, people of great wealth, that they were the ones whose burials contained these coins, which suggested they were the ones who were disposing of it. And when that was all you had, it was a reasonable conclusion to draw. Nowadays, there's just far more material, particularly in places where there are national databases that metal detector users report their finds to. But I think on the back of that, scholars, including me, but also lots of others, have gone back to various texts talking about how people lived and how the economy worked in this period, and they've been able to see that there is evidence, there are references to peasants gathering silver, more occasionally gold, but particularly silver coins, so they can go and pay their rent. And in order to get that silver to pay their rent, they'd have to use markets. So you can see a version of the classic manorial economy, as it's often called, the medieval sort of feudal in the sort of Marxist sense, the feudal economy starting to emerge, where there is a sort of combination of seigneurial and commercial pressure that's driving peasants to use markets, and coins are an important part of that. The finds that you see of these coins are spread all over the countryside. You occasionally discover them in peasant households or in rural settlements. I think basically everyone was using coins at least sometimes. I think that sometimes is the big qualifier. There would be some characters like merchants, aristocrats, wealthy ecclesiastical institutions that used them a lot, possibly even on a daily basis. And then there'd be other members of society, peasants, particularly poorer peasants, who might only use them once or twice a year. I suspect most people would fall somewhere in between that, in between those two extremes, and they'd use them on a weekly, monthly basis, paying rent, going to market, getting things they require that they can't secure more locally through networks of credit. And that's what was really driving the monetary economy in most places. There were some areas where I think the aristocracy and the elite were more prevalent, but I think that even in the early Middle Ages, the larger bulk of the population, the peasantry, was playing a large role.
Professor, you argue that coined money was a powerful tool for articulating one's place in social and economic structures. Can you walk us through a vivid historical example where a single coin transaction told a much bigger story about power, status, or obligation?
There are a great many you could choose from. This is one of the most fun this is one of the most fun parts of writing this book, was discovering all of these examples, picking out the best ones, writing them up. One that I don't think had been picked up before that was particularly interesting came from a French charter from the middle of the 11th century, a charter from Eastern France. And it talks about how there is a settlement made between a church, a monastery, and a knight and some of his confederates who've been trying to take away some of the land of this church. And so they make this agreement and they decide that they're going to hand over some money to the Lord himself and a pig to his wife, because that's the way they do things. They're mixing and matching coins and commodities at this stage. And so one of the monks is designated to go to this lord's house and hand over the money and the pig. And so off he goes. Presumably he's got the pig on a little rope or something, and he turns up and he discovers that the Lord is there. That's all fine. He hands over the pig, but this Lord has got three young sons who are all under the age of 8. We know this from the language that's used in the charter. And these young sons were not at this meeting. They were not part of that deliberation. And that means, therefore, they did not swear to uphold this agreement. And so if 10 years down the line, these sons have grown up, they might decide to take up this quarrel again, and they could quite legitimately say they had never sworn to do otherwise. So the monk does some quick thinking, and he takes some extra coins out of his sleeve, which is where you hide them if you're an early medieval person, and he gives each of these boys one coin and says, right, you also have to swear to uphold this agreement. And so he gives these three little boys the coins, and they all say, that's what I will do. And there are loads of cases like this. There's another fantastic one, again from France in the 11th century, where there's a peasant from the Loire near this famous monastery called Fleury, and he decides he doesn't want to be a servile peasant anymore who is beholden to the saint of the monastery. So he just runs away and he goes to eastern France, he goes to Burgundy, and he sets himself up living in a castle. He's got weaponry, he's got hunting dogs, he marries a local lady, he's living the aristocratic dream of 11th century France. And then one day, a monk from Fleury happens to be visiting to take care of some estates the church owns there, and he sees this guy and he says, hang on a minute, you are actually one of our peasants, and you ran away. You got to come back. And so the man says, no, 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 I'm not a peasant. And of course, he's actually called Starbalis in this story, which means stable. You know, it's a kind of joke that he should have remained stable, but he hasn't. And so the two parties in this quarrel go to the local lord, who says that since there isn't an obvious answer either side, it needs to go to trial by combat, which was understood as a way for God to make the decision. And so the knight, who is actually a peasant, gets a bit worried because he doesn't really know how to fight. And then the monk, who can't fight himself because he's a monk, gets one of the real hardcore local knights to stand up and fight for him. So this champion comes sort of storming onto the field, clearly he knows what's up. And then Starbalis the peasant realizes that it's not a good idea to go ahead with this. So he quietly takes a single coin out of his sleeve and he quietly drops onto the ground saying, okay, Benedict. Benedict was the patron saint of this monastery. He says, okay, Benedict, I'm paying up. I'm recognizing that I am your peasant and this coin is a symbol of that. So he takes out this coin, drops it on the ground. Immediately, the coin grows to be the size of a shield, and everyone hears the name of St. Benedict resounding through the whole valley. Now, not surprisingly, at this point in the story, everyone realizes that something strange is going on, and they decide that they are not going to go ahead with the combat, and that Starbalis is going to go back to his monastery. I don't think that's really what coins were doing every day. They weren't growing to magic size. They weren't being used in these dramatic contexts quite like that. But I think this is telling of what people thought coins did, the symbolic resonance that they had when people exchanged them, that you could use them to signify these changes in status, to symbolize relationships between people in a public setting. I think that's really crucial. It's very often in a context where people can see what's going on, and exchanging coins was a way of telling everyone around you that this was a transaction between two distinct parties settling a transaction, and that was it. It was quit, and everyone could go their separate ways.
Dr. Naismith, your book is built around three central questions. Who used coinage? Why did they use it? And what did they use it for? If you had to give us the single most surprising answer to any one of those three, what would it be?
I suppose there were lots of answers to all of them. Probably the one that surprised me most is that having sat down and written this book, thought a lot about these questions for a long time, I was left thinking that the main reasons they used coins and the main context in which they used them was generally in commerce. It was for buying and selling. I think that overall this was still the dominant way in which coins were used in the early Middle Ages. It wasn't always the reason coins were made. I think that's an important distinction. Very often they were made to fulfill a specific immediate purpose that was driven by kings or lords, people who are more likely to have a large stock of coins on hand. But once those coins had been made and put into circulation, they would then generally circulate in a context of commerce. That the things that we see more often in texts, like paying your rent, giving gifts. These things tend, I think, to be overrepresented in the written record because it's coming from that segment of society. It's coming from churches. It's coming from the higher up elite who are more involved with things like that. But I think that the archaeological evidence and reading some of these texts against the grain, it shows that actually the monetary economy was, while very different in some respects, in terms of how it actually worked, in terms of what people most often did with their coins, I don't think it was so very different from a lot of other societies in the past, in Europe, in other places too, that coined money, cash, it tends to be associated with market activity.
Professor, you examine not just how coins were used, but how the metal itself was sourced, mined, and circulated. How much
Hmm.
did the availability of silver and gold physically constrain or enable economic life in early medieval Europe?
It's certainly important because if you're in a world where the coins are mostly made of gold or silver, you've got to have the metal. You can't just will it into being. Having said that, I do think that it's in the past there was a tendency to think a bit too much in terms of supply driving all of this. There was a sense that when somebody found a new mine, all of a sudden you'd see more coins for a few decades and then things would fall off again. I think it's almost the opposite way round. You can see that these mines are there, and often they're exploited on a small scale, and then they start to be exploited on a much larger scale when the scale of the currency starts to increase. In other words, when people want more coin, they go and exploit the mines more intensively. You can see this at Mel in Western France, which was the major source of the late 8th and 9th centuries. You can see it in the Harz Mountains in Germany, which were a major source of the 10th and early 11th centuries. And yeah, I think that's absolutely crucial. Looking into this issue of where the metal comes from, I think is one of the great growth areas of this subject, and it's one area where I'm trying to go beyond what was in the book. There was this project that you mentioned of looking at the sources of silver. That was a huge surprise because this looked at the coins of the first silver pennies, basically the coins of the late 7th, early 8th century, and tried to answer the question of where this big injection of silver came from. And we didn't quite know what the answers would be going into it. We thought it might be Mail, it might be Germany. But in actual fact, it showed pretty clearly that it was coming from the Eastern Mediterranean. It was coming from the Byzantine world. And so it's very unlikely for various historical reasons that this was coming immediately from the Byzantine world at the time in which these coins were made. It's much more likely it had entered Western Europe at least 50 or 100 years earlier. So there's probably a big stockpile of silver that had been built up, but not immediately used for coin. It was presumably being used for other things. It was stockpiled in things like the silver plate that was found in the Sutton Hoo ship burial from Eastern England that was deposited in the early 7th century. So I think that the sources of silver are really important, but they're not, as it were, driving the whole monetary economy. I think they're just part of the story of how this material is being sourced, and it's in a complex dance with demand as well.
Professor, you discuss a notable reconfiguration of Allied power in relation to coinage during the 10th and 11th centuries. What changed and why does it matter for our understanding of how medieval states evolved?
Well, in several parts of Europe, you can see that there is a general resurgence in the amount of money that's being made and used in the later 10th and 11th centuries. And on the one hand, it looks like this is mostly being used by the bulk, by the mass of society, by peasants, which accounts for most of the population at this stage, people in towns, and so forth. The difference seems to be that at this stage, there's an increasing level of elite power over, well, at local levels all over Western Europe. And the coinage is one way in which lords are exerting that. You can see this particularly in England and Germany in the form of hundreds of new mint places coming online. In Germany, there's about 150 of these that appear in the 11th century. In England, in the same period, there's a total of about 120. Most of these weren't there 100 years earlier. So you can see that there are lots of these new places coming online, but interestingly, most of them don't make that many coins. What that says to me is that by and large, they represent local authorities who are really keen to try and take a bite out of this new resource. They want money. They want to have some sort of involvement with this growing monetary economy, and they want to do it on their own terms as local lords who've got these controls over production and circulation. But in practice, they can't really dictate that everyone will come and produce all their silver at this mint place. So what you see is that they just make a few of them when people who require them for dealing with that particular lord will turn up. So I think that's what's changing in the late 10th and 11th centuries. You can see that lords and aristocrats are starting to try and muscle in on this business in a much more profuse way than they had before. It's not to say that it was new. Kings had done this before. I think what's different now is that you've got more people like counts, local aristocrats, thanes as they be called in England, characters like that, they're starting to get involved in a more ambitious way as well. So this means it's becoming much more diffuse, it's becoming much more localized, but at the same time, the overall amount of money, the overall amount of production, the overall amount of wealth in the economy is increasing. That's what's allowing more of these lords to step in and take a bigger bite out of it.
Professor, you draw on detailed case studies from the both Mediterranean and Northern Europe. Looking at all the history together, what does early medieval monetary life teach us about the relationship between money, trust, and social complexity? Lessons that resonate even today.
Hmm. Yeah, I've been thinking about this question. I suppose what it shows to us is that, first of all, money can mean lots of things. It's not just coins. It also encompasses credit. It also encompasses rating commodities and basically everything around you in monetary terms. And of course, we live in a time where uh, we don't use cash in on the same scale that we once did. We're very used to the idea of many different kinds of money, which are controlled by many different actors. I don't think that necessarily means we're going back to the 10th or the 11th century, but I think it does recall to us the importance of a period when money was a plurality. It was many different things united by this very loose umbrella of common denominations. Trust, I think trust inevitably becomes really important in a mechanism that is like that, where you don't have a single form of currency that is backed up by a single state. I think it raises questions about how and why people trust each other, how and why they can trust their money, because I think money ultimately is a kind of it's kind of IOU. Basically, it's saying that this is wealth that somebody will ultimately honor. This is value that somebody will ultimately respect. And that chain of trust and valuation just gets extended and extended and extended. They were able to do that in the early Middle Ages and do it when there just wasn't much silver and gold around. So I'd say it shows to us how robust trust is and how robust money can be, both when there is and isn't a lot of it.
Professor, I'd like to conclude this episode with one last question. Making
Mm.
money in the early Middle Ages has been described as a masterpiece of medieval numismatics. What was the most intellectually challenging argument to make in the book? The one that required you to most convincing overturn existing scholarship.
Uh, I'd say probably it was trying to come up with a new infrastructure for the way coined money evolved, how the scale of it evolved, but also how the role of it evolved over this period, which takes account of these new coin finds I mentioned, this large number of new finds that have turned up over the last 20, 30 years. It was also a matter of trying to look again at the texts to understand how the coins worked in their own society, and then finally link that in with the other elements of social and economic history of this period. How are kings working with the coinage? How are lords working with the coinage? How are other people, peasants and towns working with the coinage? So I'd say that in many ways, the most challenging argument was bringing it all together. The fun bit is looking at all the coins and looking at all the texts. The tricky bit was in many ways trying to link together the various chapters, different periods, different case studies, trying to rationalize it all. And I hope I came up with a scheme that makes sense. I'm sure people will challenge it as the field evolves, but that's what it's all about. That's what, in a sense, we all want to see is people thinking about this and asking more questions.
Listeners, as we wrap up today's conversation, I think it's safe to say that money has never been just about money. It has always been about power, identity, and human connection. Professor Naismith, thank you for reminding us that past has so much still to teach us. Having you on Business Talk has truly been one of our most cherished honor. Professor Naismith, thank you so much.
Thank you.